we must cry, and we all must cry together, that we want our freedom and we want it now.
Fighting for freedom for all.
We believe at rock bottom that the solution to our problems are moral.
And putting their own lives at risk while doing so.
You understood from the get-go that you could be killed at any given moment.
For decades, they led the charge, pushing for equality and striving to make our country a better place. Now, with the passing of 3 civil rights pioneers, it's time to pass the torch.
So don't get weary. Yes. Keep the faith.
Yes. There's no more single important thing to do than to remove racism from American culture.
I'm grateful. I've lived to see so many things that come to pass that I never dreamed I would live to see.
Tonight, we are celebrating Atlanta's freedom fighters, fathers of the movement.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm Jovita Moore.
And I'm Fred Blankenship. Jovita, what an important and special evening this is. It's a time to honor the lives and legacies of 3 of Atlanta's freedom fighters, Reverend C.T. Vivian and Joseph E. Lowry, and Congressman John Lewis. Reverend Vivian and Congressman Lewis passed away on Friday. And John Lewis's message was one of nonviolence.
He led a long life of fighting for civil and human rights, a life that included 34 years of defending the gains he helped secure for Black Americans.
Hate is too heavy, a burden to bear.
A civil rights icon, an advocate, Georgia Representative John Lewis dedicated his life to protecting human rights and building a country for everyone.
The full story of America cannot and will not be told until we tell the story of the history and contribution that African Americans have made.
Lewis and his siblings grew up on this farm near Troy, Alabama. His father was a sharecropper, and as a boy, he quickly noticed that life was different for people who looked like him.
I saw how my father, my uncles, my grandparents, and others were being treated. I saw the signs that said white, colored. White men, colored men, white women, colored women. To go downtown to the little town of Troy on a Saturday afternoon to the theater, all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony, and all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. I would come home and ask my mother, ask my father, my grandparents why, and they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble.
The radio introduced Lewis to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., words that ignited a fire inside of him. It inspired him to join the movement.
I was deeply inspired by this man. He inspired me. It seemed like he was saying to me, John Lewis, you too can do something. You can make a contribution.
Lewis devoted himself to the movement, joining the Freedom Riders, civil rights activists who worked to integrate bus terminals across the South. While a student at Fisk University, Lewis organized sit-in demonstrations to integrate the lunch counters in Nashville.
We live in a different America, a better America.
A better America because of the movement that was building, a movement that often ended with Lewis getting spat on, beaten, arrested, and jailed. Lewis would go on to lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Later, he helped plan the 1963 March on Washington, joining other leaders in meetings with the president, John F. Kennedy.
This was the first meeting to plan the march. This is the Big Six. This meeting took place on July 2nd, 1963, at the Commodore Hotel in New York.
A picture of that meeting was on display in his Atlanta office during my interview with the congressman in 2011. Lewis was the youngest speaker at that historic march.
It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however. Unless Title 3 is put in this bill, there's nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstration.
He also joined Dr. King back down south in the fight to get federal protection for black Americans who were denied the right to vote.
As you know, we are assembled here today to reaffirm our determination to gain the right to vote in Selma and Dallas County and all over the state of Alabama.
March 6, 1965.
I was in Atlanta discussing and debating with my colleagues in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Some people said we should march, others said we should not. I took the position that we have been in Selma since 1962. We have been arrested in 63 and 64. The people wanted to march, and we should march.
On Sunday, March 7th.
This march intends to keep off the highway. We will be marching on the shoulder of the road and will not in any way be interfering with the pursuit of traffic.
And the young came and said a prayer. We stood up. We got off our knees and lined up in twos and started walking in an orderly fashion with Jose William and myself leading the walk through the streets of Selma. We get to the edge of the bridge. Jose asked me, he said, "John, can you swim?" I said, "No." I said, "What about you?" He said, "A little." And I said something like, "Well, there's too much water there. We're not going to jump. We're going forward." We continued to walk. We came to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers.
To be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. The major said, "Troopers, advance."
Troopers, here, advance.
They came toward us. Beating us with nightsticks, driving us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I thought I was going to down that bridge. I thought I saw death. 50 years later, I don't recall how I made it back across the bridge, through the streets of Selma, back to the little church.
Yeah,
the family of John Lewis spoke out today for the first time, and they said that he was a fighter with a tenacious spirit, and he fought Jovita to the very end.
He sure did. His younger brother, Grant, shared a moment that made him smile when he talked about how the congressman didn't get his driver's license until he was in his 40s.
I would drive him around to different places, and I remember he used to tell me, before we get out of the car, "Be patient, little brother." Every time. I never questioned him. The next time we'd go somewhere, he would tell me before we opened the doors, "Be patient, little brother." All of a sudden, it dawned on me. We would go into a building to get a loaf of bread or just something, light bulb or something, which should have took 10 minutes max. It would take us 3.5 hours because he would shake every hand, take pictures with everybody that wanted to take pictures. And that's the kind of person my brother was.
Governor Brian Kemp ordered all flags supplied, half-staff on all state buildings and grounds to honor John Lewis. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms ordered flags to be lowered on City of Atlanta facilities.
Congressman Lewis's death came just as Georgians were mourning the loss of another freedom fighter.
And Jovita, longtime civil rights leader Reverend C.T. Vivian died Friday morning. And as Channel 2's Dave Huddleston explains, just like John Lewis, Vivian began fighting for equal rights at an early age.
I found out that life is in the doing, right? And that's what the movement was about. It was doing things.
The only child of farming parents, Cordy Tyndall Vivian, or CT as we knew him, was born July 30th, 1924 in Boonville, Missouri.
His family moved to Illinois in search of a better education for C.T. It was in Peoria, Illinois, where he joined the fight for civil rights in 1947, a sit-in, a nonviolent demonstration to end segregation at lunch counters in the city.
Anytime you're present, you've got to do something about the conditions that you're in.
Nearly 10 years would pass before he would meet Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
What Martin King was after is that he wrote on the window of SCLC to redeem the soul of America.
Vivian told us King's ability to inspire convinced him to join King's staff and take on a larger role in the civil rights movement. He organized sit-ins, took part in freedom rides, events that many times landed him and others in jail.
You understood from the get-go that you could be killed at any given moment.
He led a voting rights protest in Selma, Alabama. In what might be considered his defining moment, he confronted Sheriff Jim Clark on the courthouse steps.
I saw the club coming. There was a policeman on each side of him with the club held at each end. And he shot forward. It missed here and hit me right across there. Right? And just tore loose all the skin under there. And the blood came down. The blood you see there had come down from underneath.
Vivian, like many others in the movement, said he had no fear of dying.
My wife and I had already come to the conclusion, right, that if I didn't come home from one of the actions, she knew and I knew that we were dependent upon God in the first place. Not to live, but to live decently and right and achieve something worth doing.
A life dedicated to making the world a better place for generations to come.
We did our job so well that they can hardly believe that the world that existed before existed at all.
A job so well done, the nation's first black president paid tribute.
And at 89 years old, Reverend Vivian is still out there, still in the action, pushing us closer to our founding ideals.
In November 2013, President Barack Obama honored Vivian and 15 others with the nation's highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom.
It was so many years I fought for the freedom movement. So I like the fact that this is an honor of freedom.
An honor fitting for a man who never stopped doing.
You strike me as a man who's never going to stop fighting for what you believe.
Oh, it can't. I mean, I don't know how. Because there's no more single important thing to do than to remove racism from American culture. Not only for me and mine, or just for black people, but for this nation.
Wow. So the pastor who will deliver the eulogy at Reverend Vivian's funeral told us he was a man of action and was always strategizing.
Dr. Gerald Durley said now is the time for all of us to light the torch and continue the work.
C.T. Vivian probably will be larger in death than he was in life because he never sought the limelight. C.T. was always the grassroots organizer out on the march, standing at the Dallas courthouse, working with through Leadership Atlanta, through his Basics program, breaking down racial barriers.
He was so busy doing the work. He went on to say Reverend Vivian was serious about uplifting people economically and educationally. And just as Reverend Vivian's friends say that John Lewis was committed to a life of humility and action, and everyone from presidents and lawmakers to civic and religious leaders paid tribute to his legacy.
Channel 2's Richard Elliott talked with former Atlanta Mayor and Ambassador Andrew Young about his friend of 60 years and his determination to get justice.
He's been really a greater impact on this city and on this nation than any of us will ever know.
We talked with former Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young on the front stoop of his Southwest Atlanta home. Few people knew John Lewis better or longer than Mayor Young. They've been friends for nearly 60 years. Young credits John Lewis with getting him back to Atlanta and into the civil rights movement. Together, they worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on social justice causes throughout the country. Mayor Young says Lewis had a unique drive to seek justice wherever he could and had it ever since he first saw young John Lewis on the campus of Fisk University.
I was really impressed This young man has been single-minded in his purpose to pursue the freedom and dignity that America owes to all of its citizens, for all of its citizens. And it's that single-mindedness with humility and courage that makes John Lewis one of the living saints of our time.
Others are remembering John Lewis, too, and on both sides of the political aisle. His longtime friend, former Republican Senator Johnny Isakson, who famously hugged Lewis on the floor of the House, said this, quote, "I am terribly saddened by the loss of a great man. His legacy and the lessons he leaves behind have touched us all. I will miss you, my friend." Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms tweeted, "John Lewis loved unconditionally and called upon all of us to be better versions of ourselves." Governor Brian Kemp said, quote, "John Lewis changed our world in profound and immeasurable ways." Congressman David Scott tweeted, quote, "He took his fight for justice and equality for all from the depths of Bloody Sunday to the halls of Congress." Mayor Young says his friend will best be remembered for his power and his humility.
But for me, he will be remembered for the power. You don't usually think of humility and power as going together. But on the floor of the Congress, when John got up, everybody listened because they knew he was speaking from his heart as well as his head. And they knew that he had a kind of uncorruptible integrity that you had to trust.
Mayor Young says he last saw John Lewis last week when it appeared his friend had taken a turn for the worst. But even then, he believed Lewis would endure.
I knew he was weak, but John is such a fighter that I knew that if he had decided that there was something left that nobody could do but him, he would fight to come back. And so I didn't want to believe that when I heard it.
Mayor Young says he got the call of John Lewis's passing from another former Atlanta mayor, Bill Campbell, who had remained close to John Lewis for years. Young says John Lewis always saw the best of what America could be, even if it had to be reminded of it.
Never wavered from his commitment to America and America fulfilling its destiny without violence.
In Atlanta, Richard Elliott, Channel 2 Action News.
He never wavered. And for the children of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's as if they lost a member of the family. Martin King III told me they've known Lewis all of their lives. They even called him Uncle John.
When you think about what John Lewis meant to the King family, what goes through your mind right now?
The main thing that goes through my mind right this moment is that here was a man who demonstrated unearned suffering, being redemptive. He put his physical self on the line so that we could all achieve the right to vote. I think about how he touched the lives of young people by the thousands and maybe even millions around the world. Because when I saw John Lewis as our congressman, when I was with him, I never saw him ever pass by a group of young people without stopping to say something to him. He never was too busy. He never was too busy for constituents, period. And, you know, he never had any airs about him, never saw himself as better than anyone else. And certainly he very easily could have, you know, because of what he did, the doors that he opened, the sacrifices that he made. But he was always the same way, no matter when you saw him. So, you know, this is really one of our giants in our society. In a real sense, and I might say that he and C.T. Vivian transitioning on the same day, perhaps they wanted to take their last march on into the Hiberland. And that's, however tragic it is, it's quite interesting that both of them would transition on the same day. So that being their final march for our time. But these were giants. They were truly giants who would not accept no. John Lewis often said, don't give up, don't give in, don't give out. And he demonstrated that. So we have something to embrace. And when you look at the many demonstrations that we see all over our nation and world, they are inspired by John Lewis and what he continued to do throughout his life. It's very sad that in 2020 we're still trying to make sure that people have the right to vote, and voter suppression is a thing of the past. But unfortunately, it's very real, even in our own state.
You said that you called him Uncle John, and it is hard when you lose your family. How are you coping with this?
I don't ever try to use the phrase bittersweet, but that is probably what it more feels like than anything else. I mean, whenever we lose anyone, it's painful. And as I said, to some degree, some might say this is the end of an era, but it also might be a new beginning in other ways. And I think John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, Dr. Lowry, they ran their race, and they ran it extraordinarily well. And it's incumbent upon us to keep this marathon going. It's not a sprint. If it was a sprint, we'd all be resting. It's a marathon. And my mom used to say that every generation has to earn their keep. And I think that's...
And Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., used two words to help describe John Lewis: honor and sacrifice.
She talked about how he truly exemplified the nonviolent movement.
Even though it wasn't a shock, it still evokes tears because you know that they served with such strength, power, and dignity. The legacy of nonviolence was fully on display with John Lewis, and he carried it into the halls of Congress, and he handled himself very well. And so he, there's not going to be another. You don't expect to be another. Everybody needs to be themselves. But it's definitely a void.
And News Drone 2 captured this view of the Hero mural in downtown Atlanta. You can't miss it. The towering 5-story mural pays homage to John Lewis and his decades of service to the people of Georgia. And it is because of his fight. People across Metro Atlanta said they had to stop by the mural to pay their respects. And Channel 2's Audrey Washington talked with those who said there's no better time than the present to stand up for what's right.
The sound of church bells ringing echoed from Peachtree Street, down Edgewood, and finally to here on Auburn Avenue. This at the iconic Congressman John Lewis mural is where so many came to honor and remember the civil rights giant.
John Lewis is my hero.
Outside St. Luke's Church in downtown Atlanta is where I found Denise De La Rue. She stopped everything she was doing to come to the church, hear the bells, and remember John Lewis. He died Friday night at 80 years old after a long, brave battle with pancreatic cancer.
There's so little we can do at a time like this to be together and show tribute, and it seemed like such a lovely gesture, and it's just where I had to be.
Lewis died just a few hours after fellow activist C.T. Vivian passed away. The two, along with so many others, fought for equality, justice, and voter rights. 15-year-old Ashton Zienge says he's grateful.
How we can thrive in these communities and get out and become people like him, become civil rights leaders and activists and do better in our communities.
Ashton's mother says right now there is sorrow, but also peace. She believes John Lewis fought the good fight and ultimately won.
So it feels like a really big hole, but I do believe that he will still be an angel helping us from heaven.
And clearly this was a passing that touched so many people. I had the pleasure of meeting Congressman Lewis several times. He was very kind, such a gentle soul, but also intentional and a force. What he has done for people will never be forgotten. He will be missed. I'm Audrey Washington in downtown Atlanta.
And we have a rare glimpse at some of Lewis's final moments, conversations, and memories. Channel 2's Nicole Carr spoke with 3 people who were close to the congressman in his final days.
During Lewis's transition, the focus was still on his life's work and love.
I think John's whole world was wrapped up in, we've got to make these wrongs right. He was committed to that from his soul out.
To understand a bit more about John Lewis and the Giants' journey, we took a look at his life, the part that takes him from Atlanta to D.C., through the eyes of 3 people, a handful of the last to witness his final days.
I, for one, just was thinking about all of those things he had done while I'm taking these photos. Just what a moment, what a moment, what a moment.
In the last moments, the last few days, he still was emphasizing how essential it was to vote. And he kept saying, this election is the most important one we'll ever have.
Before Bill Campbell became an Atlanta mayor and before John Lewis represented Georgia's 5th District, a lifelong friendship would be cemented as office mates in Atlanta City Hall. They were a part of a trio that flipped Atlanta City Council to majority African-American leadership in 1981. The group, which would be victorious in their dissent, did not agree with then-Mayor Andy Young in the plan to run a 4-lane highway through the neighborhoods surrounding the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. But the uncomfortable discourse never turned ugly with Lewis's close friend Young. Decades later, a modified version of that road would end up bearing Lewis's name. And when Lewis set his sights on D.C. in 1986, he was facing off against another friend who was considered the people's choice, the late Julian Bond.
It was a challenge for all of us because they were such great historical figures. I was the only African-American elected official to support John Lewis in that race. And it was incredibly difficult because there were so many who underestimated the resolve of John Lewis. And if history has taught us anything, Nicole, it is that John Lewis is never to be underestimated.
Miss Clayton, love connection, matchmaker. How did you put these 2 together?
Well, it was really interesting because, Lillian was my best friend.
Renowned activist and media executive Zernona Clayton was in the movement and knew Lewis well, and she wanted her friend Lillian, a lover of languages, travel, and art, to connect with him. So she threw a private dinner party in her home in 1967. Soon after that initial meeting, Lewis spent some time in the hospital, time that would seal the fate of his love life.
When we got there, there was a woman there, and she was adjusting his bed and his pillow, and like she was really making him comfortable. And she said, I don't think I want to be fighting any competition. I said, girl, we don't have to run away from competition. I said, if we like this boy and let's pursue this, I can get rid of the competition.
And so it was done in 1968, the start of a 44-year union, a son named John Miles and Lillian becoming Lewis's chief political defender, among acts of lifelong loyalty until her 2013 death.
But got in there and dug in the trenches and was his best partner.
Let's go back to June, a day after a chemo treatment for Lewis. Before he returned to Atlanta for a final stretch of rest, Lewis's chief of staff contacted this man, D.C. photographer Gary Williams.
It's me and the mayor's photographers there as well. It's only us 2 documenting this.
Lewis making a quick trip to Black Lives Matter Plaza. Williams capturing photos of what would be the icon's last public appearance.
A couple people help him up the steps, and give him his cane. And everybody kind of just steps back and lets him, have a moment. It was hard to see his facial expression just because he had the mask on. But you could see in his eyes that it was a moment of reflection for him. You could see that he was thinking. And I kept saying to myself, I wonder what he's thinking. To have done the work that he's done, to have fought the fights that he fought, to have been beaten within inches of his life, Bloody Sunday, Selma, to think of the work that they all did to make this moment possible.
I can't emphasize enough that if we want to pay tribute to John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and Joseph Lowry and Andy Young and all of the unspoken heroes, it is to go and vote. Nothing is more fundamental and nothing is more revolutionary.
I've been telling children these last couple of days that I hope you're watching everything that's on the television. God made the supreme gift to all of us, and that was life. And the least we can do is pay back that gift by leading a good life. And John did.